Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for coming to our next in our entrepreneurship speaker series. As you guys all know, we've had some amazing speakers and diverse speakers in this series coming from all different aspects of starting up a company. And you're going to see that again today. So some people told their stories of starting multiple companies, but there's so many different parts of starting a company, right? And we're really privileged today to hear from Srin Nagaraja, who's spent a long time at the FDA and now is at G.RAU, and he's going to tell us a lot about some of the regulatory aspects of starting a company. Now, some of you know that Srin was one of my PhD students, and it was a long, long time ago. And you can tell how long ago it was by this absolutely state-of-the-art background on the slide. This was high tech to be able to fade from blue to black time in 2006 when he graduated with his PhD. And so Srin got a BS in mechanical engineering from the University of Michigan, so that made it easy to recruit him at Georgia Tech. Had a number of different activities, a lot of publications, and his thesis work actually contributed to one of our early R01s on age-related changes in bone microdamage initiation. Now, it was kind of the tradition back then to show some pictures at the time of graduation. So this is Srin back in 2006. It looks a lot like Srin in 2024, which is a little bit irritating. We used to do a run in the lab, and the joke was you had to beat the boss to graduate. Unfortunately, I lost every year, so a lot of people graduated. But yeah, Srin did a great job with his PhD, and I always roast him a little bit at their defense. So it was interesting to see what I'd done with Srin. And so I put up a quote from Srin, said, "Bob, I'm so happy." And so the question was, why was that? You know, had he had a really nice nap on his desk? There was a good chance that that was actually true. Had he finally learned how to use a pipette? Probably not true, I would guess. You probably still don't know how to use a pipette? No, I didn't. Got a date. So this was pre-Mamta. He's now has a beautiful wife and 3 children, and his wife basically runs science at NASA. So obviously he eventually got a date, but that was the question. Or had he just watched University of Michigan destroy Notre Dame 47-21? And if Callie's in the room, she's a Notre Dame graduate, but sorry, Callie, we killed Notre Dame that year. So the answer was D.
That's right.
All right, so how do I get back to his talk? I did it. All right, cool. All right, let me tell you actually some stuff about Srin. He's now a technical fellow at G.RAU Incorporated. It's a global innovative metal processing company that manufactures precision parts from a variety of metals and alloys. At G.RAU, Srin is a senior consultant to medical device companies for mechanical and corrosion testing of those implants, particularly nitinol-based devices, and a regulatory expert on device approval pathways, including submission strategies and technical considerations for assessing implant integrity and durability. Srin previously spent a decade at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, where he conducted research on spinal and cardiovascular devices and was the lead reviewer for orthopedic spinal devices, and a technical expert for the mechanical testing of medical devices intended for pre-market submissions. So some of our companies in the Knight campus are nearing this stage of their development. With over 20 years of experience in the biomedical field, Srin has expertise in mechanical and corrosion behavior of medical products and is the author of more than 100 scientific publications and presentations. He served as principal or co-principal investigator on numerous medical device research studies and has faculty appointments at Catholic University, University of Maryland, and the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. I already told you he received his PhD in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech in 2006. And today in his talk, Srin's going to discuss the medical device regulatory landscape in the US and also, interestingly, across international boundaries, highlighting recent changes in regulations that are particularly important for venture companies seeking to bring a device to market. So Srin, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Bob. And those pictures bring back a lot of memories, I can say. It's good times in Atlanta, I'd say, very, very good times. And, thanks for, inviting me here. I'm honored to be here and give a talk at this seminar series. Bob gave me a lab tour or a tour of the facility, the night campus yesterday. And, was just super impressed with the facilities that you have here, the research that you're doing here. And one of the phrases, Bob, correct me if I'm wrong, it's science advancing society, right? That stuck in my mind because, what you do here, as innovators or early venture companies, you're doing science and you're doing engineering, you're doing research, and you're producing a product. And that product could be a tissue engineered medical product, or TEMPS as they call it at the FDA. It could be software with machine learning or AI. It could be an implant. It could be sensors. We talked about sensors yesterday as well. So any of these products, there's a very high probability that would need to get regulatory authorization or a regulatory approval. So if we think about what you're doing, any of those products need to before they can advance society, they need to go through a regulatory process and a regulatory approval. And that can be quite daunting. If you're an innovator, if you're an early venture company or a startup company, that can be quite daunting because, you understand the science and the engineering behind your product, but you may not necessarily understand everything that there is to know about trying to get through this regulatory process. And some of the questions that are going to be asked by the FDA or Health Canada or the notified bodies in Europe. And so, my goal today, by the end of this talk, is hopefully we can make it a little less daunting and talk to you guys about different pathways that have been put out there by regulatory agencies to try to help speed innovative devices to the market. When I was at the FDA, there was the head of the Center for Devices was Jeff Shuren, Dr. Jeff Shuren. And, one of the things he brought with him to that position was this sense of we need to have medical devices, novel medical devices here in the US first. Because when I started in 2007, as Bob showed, at the FDA, there was a lot of devices that were first in man, early feasibility outside of the US. They were going to Europe, they were going to other countries. And so there was a big effort by the FDA, and I want to talk to you about some of that because I think that'll be very helpful as you guys go through your process here at Oregon of developing a device of what pathways are available to help speed that through. So Bob talked about a lot of this already, so I won't highlight it. But when I was coming out of Bob's lab, I had looked at postdocs. I had actually applied for a faculty position and interviewed at Clarkson University up in upstate New York. So I was really thinking about the academic track. But then Bob sent an email to me about this position at the FDA, and I had no idea they actually had research labs. Just thought of them as regulators. And so they have an Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories at the FDA. And so it really piqued my interest, and it gave me a sense of, I could do academic types of research or what they call regulatory research within the framework of the government. And I could learn both the regulatory approval process, but also contribute with scientific publications. And so that's what that was my position there. And so not only was I doing research on medical devices, but also was an internal consultant to the regulators. So when the regulators, their job is, of course, to manage a project, right, which is a regulatory submission. So they're not going to be experts in everything. So they would parse out, say the regulatory file was this big, they'd parse out the part of the submission that would be related to, say, mechanics and durability, and they would send that to me and I would review it. And so, it was a very interesting and unique position, and was able to work on, I'll talk about FDA guidance documents, but that's how the agency communicates their recommendations to the public. And then, over the last 6 years or so, 7 years now, I've been at G.RAU Inc, as Bob mentioned. We're an independent testing laboratory that's based in the Bay Area near Santa Cruz. And we do implant mechanical testing. We do a lot of regulatory strategy work with our clients. And then we have expertise in material processing and manufacturing. And so we're an ISO certified facility that does testing and consulting services for the medical device industry. And we still do research as well. So we still have a component of research that we do at our facility. So this is in one of the papers that we published when I was back at FDA right before I left. We wanted to talk about computational modeling, and I'll get to that in a second, but we wanted to just look at the whole total product life cycle of a medical device. So we published this, and a lot of what you're doing here at Oregon is in this space of the discovery, ideation, invention and prototyping. I saw a lot of the facilities you have to do this, and you're going through this iterative process where you are hopefully optimizing the design of whatever that product is, or the software that's being used, or the sensor technology. And then you get to a point where there's some preclinical work, and you have the facilities here, of course, with the animal facility. There's also, when I say preclinical, the non-clinical bench tests that you would do. And then you would potentially go into a clinical trial, depending on the risk of the device. And then hopefully you get a favorable regulatory decision. And then there's a product launch, and then possibly redesigns, or if there's an issue, there could be a root cause for potential failures that had occurred in the field. And what question I get most, we work with a lot of startup companies, early venture companies, and they come to us, and one of their first questions is, how do I get my device to market? And there's really two things in that. The first is, what types of tests do I need to do? What types of analysis and tests do I need to do? And that would be kind of in this bucket here. So you have bench, you have animal, you have computational, right? Types of approaches you can use. So what are those tests? Because, as an early venture company, you might only have a certain amount of money and resources. And so you want to use that as efficiently as possible. So they really want to understand, what do I need to do here? Because I don't want to spin my wheels and have to do, 10 non-GLP studies, right? I don't want to have to do that. And so that's one of the questions I get. The other question is how quickly and efficiently can I get a first-in-human or an early feasibility, or a pivotal trial? And the reason for that, of course, is that a lot of the let's say landmarks or milestones that the funding is based on certain landmarks and milestones, and one of them is first in human, right, or early feasibility. So these are the two big questions I get, and this is where I'm going to try to help with this, and how to navigate this whole process of the total product life cycle. So just to take a step back, the medical device, the global market is about 500 billion, and there's estimates, and it's rapidly expanding. I mean, there are some forecasts that say by 2032, so we're talking 8 more years, that this could be $850 billion. So it's really, really going at a very rapid pace. The U.S. is about 180 billion, depending on which I guess source you look at. So it's roughly about, say, 40% of that. So it's a large portion of the U.S. market is. And if you put Europe in there, 180 billion plus 140 billion, you're talking about almost 65% of the total market, right? And then there's Japan, India, Israel. There's obviously a lot of others here as well. A lot of my talk is going to focus on the US FDA, and part of that is because of how big of the market we see here in the United States. It's a huge market, and also, if you get an FDA approval, that facilitates approvals or marketing in other countries as well, right? So I'm going to focus a lot of the talk on the US FDA. I'm going to touch on some of the international markets, but I think, for early venture startup companies, a lot of them now are coming back to the US, to be honest, and they want to have their devices approved here before they go elsewhere. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I think, classes, you guys have covered this, but I did want to just really tie this with the types of pathways that are available. So, class 1 is the lowest risk devices. Those are like instruments, general surgical instruments that you see over here on the right. And there's no FDA approval that's required. You just need to register with the FDA. You have to follow what's called general controls, which has certain provisions, like you can't adulterate your product, they call it, which means you can't modify the product and do those kinds of things. Class 2 devices, medium risk devices. In the orthopedic space, there's a lot of class 2 devices. You can see the pedicle screw system, interbody fusion cages. That typically goes through, it's a 510(k) process, which is what we call kind of a Me Too product, right? So it's comparison to an already existing medical device that's out there, which we call a predicate device. And then you have class 3 devices, which are your highest risk. So a lot of cardiovascular devices. This is a transcatheter heart valve frame. or heart valve. This is a stent. And so that goes through the PMA approval. And between the, typically, right here before pre-market approval is what's called an IDE, an investigational device exemption. And what that means is it allows you to have a clinical trial in the US. So if you get an IDE approval, that means that you can have a clinical trial in the US. So that's, again, for an early venture company, that's, essentially where that's the kind of the first stage is trying to get into a clinical trial, right? So we'll talk a little bit about IDEs and what's an efficient way to do that. There's some alternative pathways. There's a humanitarian use, which basically is a category if you have a certain condition that only affects a certain amount of the population. So you can only sell so many of those devices in the US per year. So it's kind of capped at that. Then there's de novo pathway, which I think it's a really interesting pathway because it wasn't used very much at the FDA for a long time. In fact, when I was at the FDA, we did some historical searches on kind of the use of a de novo pathway, and I'll explain what that means, but it wasn't used very much. It's really being used a lot more, and I think it's actually a really, really good pathway. A really recent clearance is degradable magnesium screws. So some of these were approved for use in Europe, but there had never been a completely degradable magnesium-based fracture fixation screw that had been approved in the US. And Bioretic, the company, got their de novo approval or authorization last year in 2023. So if we look at trends, just with the FDA, and this is a little bit older data, but it's from, over a 3-year period from 2018 to 2021, we see a 50% increase in 510K submissions. IDE submissions, those are ones to, get a clinical trial started, 80% increase. PMA, 100% increase. In just 3 years, that's what's happening, right? You can see the trends on this chart here. So there's a lot of submissions coming into the agency, and the agency has to be able to handle this. And so this isn't maybe very well known, but there's something called MDUFA, which is the Medical Device User Fee Act. And what it does is the negotiation between FDA and industry to set fees. So there's fees that companies have to pay for the review of their application. And what that does is tied to that is the negotiation of what we see here, which is how quickly a time to decision has to happen. So the goals for what we currently are in, which is MDUFA 5 now, which is for 510Ks, it has to be 90 FDA days that there needs to be a decision, so 3 months. But now there's shared days. So when I say FDA days, I mean the FDA will review it. They get, so they say take the first 60 days to review it. They send it back to the company, and the clock stops for the FDA at 60 days. And then however long the company takes, could be 30 days, whatever it is, they send it back, and then the clock starts again. So that's what the 90 is. But now there's shared days. So industry said, we'll give you more money to get more resources, but we want shared days now. So shared days are combined FDA and company days. So you can see there 112 to 124 shared days. So because what the medical device industry wanted was they want to understand total time, not just FDA time, right? And so they're trying to negotiate here, and you can see kind of the different pathways and what those shared days are. There's no shared days right now for de novo, so it's still just FDA days. And that's because the de novo process, as I'll explain, is for novel devices. So what that means, if you can go on the website and see, is this is the cost. These are the costs for different submissions, and I highlighted the main ones here: 510K, PMA, and de novo. And you can see if you're a small business, it's about a fourth. The cost about a fourth of what you'd pay if you were, say, a large company like a Zimmer or a Medtronic. You obviously have to pay the standard user fees. So there's the FDA also recognizes, of course, that a lot of these companies that are producing novel devices are small companies, considered small businesses. And so they would qualify for a reduced fee for that. So if we go back to this, as I was thinking about this, I wanted to kind of just talk about the pathways, or at least the interactions with the FDA I think that would be the most beneficial for an early venture company. And I'm going to talk about the pre-submission process. And in there, there's something called an informational meeting. And then just the normal pre-submission process. And these would be generally where you'd want to interact with the agency. And then, of course, if you wanted to start a early feasibility or an IDE, then that's where it is. So I'm going to focus on kind of these different submissions and also talk a little bit about the de novo pathway, which is over here. So pre-submissions. This is great for novel devices. Fantastic. Whenever I talk with a company and they say, we want to go to the FDA, what's the first thing we should do or what should do? I say, do an informational meeting or a standard pre-submission. I did one recently with a company last year, which was an academic university, actually a fairly large academic university. So a doctor had an idea, worked within the university, and they had a very novel way to address a condition that's already out there, and we submitted to the FDA as an informational meeting. And why this is really important, I think, is if you're at a very early stage, and you have a very novel concept or one that is unique. What this does is it gives the agency the opportunity to familiarize themselves with this device or this product, and then they can actually internally get the right expertise and resources to be able to be on that team that would review it. And so if you come to them early in an informational meeting, you're doing that. And FDA is really what they call in listening mode at that point. And it's much more collaborative too, particularly if it comes from a university, to be honest. I think that they're much more collaborative in that aspect of saying, okay, we understand you have this, and here are some of the considerations that you should think about. And I've had really good interactions with the agency on both sides, actually, when I was at the agency as well as outside with these informational meetings. So it's not really that you're getting a formal feedback at that point, but you're helping the agency understand what your product is, and also getting any sort of preliminary feedback from the agency in an informal kind of setting. A regular pre-submission, I think, is like vital and very, very important for startup companies. This is where you've gotten to a point. You can kind of see on that scale, on the total product lifecycle scale. Now you've moved up from the ideation stage. You've got a design that you think is good, and now you want to really understand what types of animal testing should you do, what types of bench testing should you do, and this is a way to do that. And there's no cost for this. This is right now a free program that the FDA has instituted, and it has been a wildly successful one, because one of the challenges, so Bob asked me to talk about challenges, right, that early venture companies run into. One of the biggest ones I see is that they don't take advantage of this pre-submission process, and they jump right into it. And they've already done testing that the agency said, well, if you'd come to us earlier and submitted a protocol, we would have told you that that was the wrong way to do it. Now go back and do it again. Or here's some animal testing, and that's costly and time consuming, and they'd have to redo it again, right? And so this is where I think, I know the feedback is 70, 75 days. And so I know with a lot of companies, sometimes they're trying to, reduce the time as much as possible. But this 70 to 75 days is worth the wait, in my opinion, to get feedback from the FDA on topics that you're unsure at this point would be sufficient for a regulatory submission. And I put in green here kind of the three main areas where I really see the benefit, right? So, familiarizing the technology, I think, goes back to the informational meeting, right? So that's kind of the informational meeting one. But then the regulatory strategy, sometimes if it's unclear, right? Say you have a combination product, right? It could be a biologic with a device. It could be a drug with a device. You don't know what's the primary. You don't know what the agency would think would be the primary mechanism that the device is, or the drug or the biologic is doing. That's where you would want to do this. And then really where we've focused a lot with startup companies is getting study protocols, whether it's bench, animal, or clinical study protocols, to the agency and have them give feedback. I think that's been, probably the main benefit of this, because you don't want to keep spinning your wheels at this stage. You want to be able to get some clarity on what makes the most sense going forward. So I'm not going to talk about all the contents, but I think the ones that are highlighted in bold are the most important, which is, having a device evaluation strategy. That's kind of the lingo or the term they use at FDA now, is a DES, not a drug-eluting stent, but a device evaluation strategy. And then, on top of that, having a test plan and protocols. So these are like kind of the crux of the meat of a pre-submission that the FDA is going to want to see. And so I'm just going to be an example here of what's a DES. Okay. Back in kind of the engineering, when I was in school at engineering, they had this failure modes and effects analysis, right? And so this is kind of that way, if you think about it, what you're laying out is, what are your safety concerns? What and how do I address them? So this is just one example. So implant integrity is one, right? And that's one I deal with a lot. And so corrosion could be the problem. So what is the potential effect? So you lay this out to the agency in this tabular format, and you do this for each of, the safety concerns. And importantly, what they want to see is, what testing or what mitigation are you planning to use? And that could be testing. It could be a justification, like a rationale for why you don't think that this is, needs testing. It could be literature. So there's a lot of different things that you could do. Or you could say, this is something that doesn't come to the level of concern currently. So we will address this at a later time. And you're letting the agency know, kind of when that's going to be addressed. I think this has been really, really useful. So the agency understands the overall plan of what you have and when you're going to be doing certain tests, or if you're going to provide a rationale or a justification for why you don't believe it should happen. This is a bench testing example. This is a very generic one. You can actually go on the FDA website and look up approved stents, and they'll have this bench test plan summarized. So I just pulled one here. And basically it goes through, and for the non-clinical tests, it'll say, essentially in a very kind of compact format to the agency, what all the tests you're planning to do. And you would have one for, say, biocompatibility. You would have maybe an animal one as well, right? In terms of, what GLP studies, what animals are you doing, what sample sizes, what groups, that kind of thing. So this is very important, I think, as a pre-submission. And, this has been, again, as I said, very well received. It's been increasing 10 to 20% per year. Again, older data, but this is just going up and up with more recent years. This trend is continuing to increase. So, this is one where, if you're, again, an early venture company and you're interested in getting initial feedback from the agency, a pre-submission is fantastic. This is the one I was mentioning about novel devices. So, you have the 510(k) process, which needs a predicate. You have to have a predicate that's already been cleared. Then you have the PMA, which is for high-risk devices. And so the agency came up with the de novo for novel devices that are low to moderate risk. And they haven't previously been classified because there's no predicate. There's no classification of it. So this process was rarely used. And I think a lot of times it was because, industry didn't quite understand how to use this process. And so they kind of shied away from it, and they either tried to somehow get it through the 510(k) process, or they went to a PMA and they just ignored this. But this has been actually, I'm showing you three here. I just talked about the degradable magnesium screws, but Apple, for their hearing aid software now is in their AirPod Pros. So they went through the de novo process because there was no predicate there already. So they have software that's for hearing, that the AirPods can be used as like a hearing aid, essentially, with the software. So that's an example of a software as a medical device, basically, or SAMD as they call it. And then this one was pretty recent, is OsteoBoost belt. So it goes back to the research, Bob, if you remember, about the vibration impacts on bone and bone cells, which is what my wife worked on, actually. Well, they've now commercialized this. And so it's a belt, essentially, that provides this vibratory loading, essentially, on the hip. And this, people that are osteopenic or osteoporotic can walk around with this belt, and it's supposed to provide that stimulation to increase your bone density. And that went through the de novo process again, because it was a novel device, but it was, identified as moderate risk. And they were able to go through this and get it, approved in a much, let's say, quicker than if they had to go through, say, a PMA process. So, this is, I think, a really good one to think about if you're an early venture company, because a lot of the technologies you guys are looking at are going to be novel and may not have a predicate already out there to lean on. And so there's a whole FDA guidance documents that talks about that. So the other question that I think, I was telling you I get is, how do I get a first in man? How quickly can I get into a first in man or an early feasibility study? And how do I do it in the US? Because certainly first in man can occur in South America. It can occur in, outside of the US. And so this program was developed while I was there and has also been very, very successful, particularly in cardiovascular devices. It's been wildly successful. Really where it is that you've gotten to the point as an innovator, as a early venture company, where you say, I've done all of my, or I've done some non-clinical bench testing, I've done animal testing, but I can't go any further unless I put it in a human patient, right? So for tissue injury medical products, this is probably a great one to look at, because you can only go so far with bench studies or animal studies. You really need to get the human experience in it. And so and the devices or the products don't need to be in their final form. Like, they don't need to be completely finalized. The FDA understands that they could still be in development, but you need to get this data so that you could either iterate again the process, or you can change, say, the procedure or refine your population. So there's been about 60 early feasibility studies approved every year since 2017, since this program started. And one of the things that I noticed when I was there, as well as talking with some of my former colleagues when at the FDA that are at the FDA still, is really the biggest hurdle for a company to get an EFS approval is the adequacy of their non-clinical testing. That's been the biggest thing. That's the gating issue, is that the companies will go and submit for an EFS, and the FDA will come back and tell them, you didn't do the appropriate bench tests, or the computational model wasn't appropriate. You need to go back and do more. And then it goes into this iterative process, which takes time. And so, essentially what the FDA is saying is basic safety must be demonstrated. And we're okay with having, less test items now, so you can defer some of these. You can have a smaller sample size. So when we talk about, say, cardiovascular devices, it needs to be statistically justified. So a lot of times you see a 95% confidence and a 90% reliability for, say, a durability test, or a reliability test. And so you need to do 29 samples. But for an EFS, you don't. The FDA has been very clear on that you don't need to have a statistical justification, but you can't make it really small. They're okay with shorter durations as well. So if you're doing a durability test, you don't have to do a 600 million cycle test for, say, a heart valve, or a 400 million cycle test for a stent, but you could do something smaller. That's more reasonable, maybe a 1-year equivalent or a 2-year equivalent. And so, there's a lot of flexibility in this program, but one of the problems is that, again, it's this disconnect between what the FDA is looking for and what the company provides, which has really been the gating issue on this. And I think a really important point is the computational modeling. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, but computational modeling has become a big push at the agency. And I really strongly urge people to look into computational models. And if that's something that could be used to help support, your product, it's a fantastic way. And the agency has been very open to looking at computational modeling. So these are two programs that the FDA has initiated not very recently, but fairly recently. 2018 is this one, and then there's one that's very recent. So for novel devices, they wanted to find a pathway. So this gets back to the center director, Jeff Shuren. He was really pushing for, if you have a really novel device, is there something we can create that could help expedite the process? And so there's this breakthrough device program. And you can see some of the statistics there. Over 700 devices have been granted breakthrough device. And really the most important part of that is right in here. So there's a lot more interactive and timely communication with the agency. A lot of times the frustration with companies would be is that it would be a long time between interactions. And so there would be a lot of waiting time, and then you'd get, some sort of feedback, but then again, it would take another, set of time that would go by before you'd hear back. So what this is meant to do is what's called sprint discussions. So you can basically get that feedback within 45 days. And there's a lot of informal discussions that can happen. And so this is a program that I've seen with companies that get breakthrough device. They get their device through to the clinical trials much quicker in this program. So to be eligible, you have to have number one first. So you have to essentially submit to the agency through a pre-submission process, again, that says this product that I have is more effective than what's out there currently. And then you have to have at least one of number two there. So there's 2A, 2B, 2C, and 2D. And so you need to be able to, in your submission, state that you can hit one and any one of the twos. A lot of times what I see actually in the submissions is that you essentially state you can hit one and all of the twos, right? So you kind of, say I can do, all of these. And so there's a process essentially that there's a 60-day process to decide if you're a breakthrough. And then after that, you can go through and have what they call interactive sprint discussions. The other one that came out pretty recently in 2023 was what's called the TPLC Advisory Program, or the TAP program. Another thing that the agency realized, a pain point within within the medical device industry, is if you look here, there's the company, which is called the sponsor, and then there's the FDA down here, and the breakthrough kind of helps this path, this line right here that's going between FDA and sponsor. But there's a whole nother area here that really isn't accounted for in the breakthrough device program, which is the payers, the patients, and the providers. So when you go to a clinical trial, a lot of times, Medicare, hasn't, they haven't had the chance to review it and say that we're going to reimburse for that. So when you go into a clinical trial, the company's paying for all of that, right? They're paying for the there's no reimbursement, so they're paying for the devices, and so that becomes a pain point, especially for, again, startup companies. And so they're now trying to close this triangle here and really work with their other government agency, right, which is Medicare and Medicaid services, to be able to even have an approval for an investigational device to be reimbursed, which I think is a pretty cool thing that they're trying to do. So in this coordination, the TAP group at the FDA is trying to work with all of these three to have this process go very, very smooth. And I can go to here. So it started in 2023, and it was first in cardiovascular devices, and they had up to 15 devices. And I worked with one company that was designated for this, and I can tell you that their time to a pivotal trial was cut at least in half, for this process. And the reason is there was monthly meetings with the FDA to discuss pretty much any topic, as long as it wasn't kind of something that was a larger topic that needed more time for the FDA to review. As you can see here, there's a teleconference if you request it within 14 days of your request. And then, one of the big pain points with industry and really within the agency is biocompatibility. That's a really, really big one. And so they've made it an effort here to, within 21 days, get back to the company about biocompatibility questions and concerns. And so this has been a really, really, important program that they've introduced. This year, it was they opened it up to radiological health and ophthalmic devices, so eye devices. And then, importantly for next year, it's orthopedic devices. And I think that's really going to open things up with orthopedics quite a bit. So I think this is going to be a really, really good program. So far, they've gotten great feedback from industry about this program. It's essentially, you have to be a breakthrough device already. So you already have to have the designation. I kind of passed over that, but you already have to have the breakthrough device designation. And then you apply for this program. So it's like a funnel. You know, you start with breakthrough. If you can get that, then you can become a subset of the breakthrough can become a TAP designee. Okay, so I'm going to switch a little bit and talk about kind of the testing and analysis approaches for early venture companies. So these are the 4 models. So in that same publication, we talked about the 4 different models, and we weighed their relative strengths and limitations for each of the models. And this is really to talk about mostly computational modeling and its use. And so what happens is computational modeling has become a big part of the agency's, let's say, submission process. Lots and lots of people are using computer models now to do it with their submissions. One thing I want to say for early venture companies is that there's FDA recognizes standards. So, you know, one of the things I would highly recommend is if you do have a product in a certain space, go and look and see what recognized standards are available. It makes things a lot easier. So you can see here, you know, the ISO 10993 is biocompatibility. You have specific ones for, you know, stents or heart valves, you know, even methods for just testing, durability testing. So, you know, they're FDA recognized, which means that if you go in and say, I'm going to be, you know, conforming to the standard, that alleviates, you know, several kind of questions the agency might have because they've already vetted it. They've probably already had review FDA designees in those standards committees. And then guidance documents is a really important one. Go look on the FDA website for it. So you can see here, there's actually considerations for animal testing and how to do that, or for medical device clinical studies and using an adaptive design, which basically is a more efficient way to do your clinical trials. So there's a ton of guidance documents, and this is the way the agency communicates to the public about what their recommendations are for certain device types. Or even categories. So these are really, really important. You know, I was on the computational modeling one here, was a co-author for that one. The Nightingale guidance, I was the lead author for that one. So these are ones that are, the FDA has been producing more and more of these and quickly so that they can get their recommendations out to industry. I mentioned computational modeling and how that's a regulatory science priority now. You can see here, this is the publications by FDA scientists. And you can see here that the average annual publications has been increasing in computational modeling. So this is a big area where they want companies to really think about computational modeling. And these are the different disciplines already that have been, these areas here have been, right here is where pre-market and post-market has been used. So solid mechanics, fluid mechanics, heat transfer. So there's a lot of different areas. The one thing that the agency now has really put an emphasis on is making sure your computational models are regulatory grade, which basically means they need to have credibility. So we talk about validation of computational models. That's a huge thing now. So like in academic, you know, I see a lot of papers that are published in academia that don't have a validated model. At least they don't put it in the papers. And when you get to the agency, the first question they're going to ask is, how did you validate this? How credible is model? How much can we trust the model, right? That's the main question. So they've come out with a bunch of documents, either with working with standards organizations or themselves. So there's 2 guidance documents here about how to assess credibility. And I won't go into it, but there's a whole evidence levels that you have to meet to be considered credible. So these 2 guidance documents, well, this one particularly was just published, is a really good resource for how you would validate and do verification on your computational models. Another thing I would highly recommend is looking at the FDA website for medical device development tools. So these are actually FDA qualified tools. So maybe you even have something that could become a medical device development tool. You've come up with, you know, a computational model of a knee that can simulate, of course, you know, instead of doing testing, you can actually simulate, let's say, the wear that occurs there. You can get that qualified by the FDA, and then actually, if it's qualified, it can be, you know, that can be marketed essentially. So a company could pay, your company to essentially use your model, essentially. So the FDA has now allowed for these medical device development tools that are qualified by the FDA to be used as part of the regulatory process. And the whole idea, again, is to kind of speed the regulatory approval process by using an MDDT. And then regulatory science tools they're not qualified by the FDA, but they're kind of peer-reviewed resources. So it's hard to see here, but like this one here is by one of my former colleagues. He's still at the FDA, but it's about using, they came up with generic 3D printed cages so that the companies could use those STL files and then print out on their printer those generic ones and then do testing on them to be able to say, okay, I'm getting the same numbers as what the FDA got, those kinds of things. So these are really great. We actually have a paper that I've worked with my colleagues on that's going to become a regulatory science tool about verification, validation, credibility of computational models for spinal fusion constructs, essentially. So this is a great resource to look at. I mean, they even have now a human shoulder finite element model, so you can pull that finite element model further and put your device into that as well. So a lot of good tools out there for folks that that are looking to kind of speed it through the regulatory process. All right, so I know I'm running short on time, so I'm going to actually skip this, but just wanted to say that the FDA now has also come out with an accreditation scheme for test labs. So we're an independent testing laboratory. There's lots of them across the country, and what they found is that even though there's standards that the labs say they adhere to, there's still a lot of variability in how they run that, right? Because the standards some of them aren't very prescriptive. So there's room where it takes a lot of time to review. And the major pain point was biocompatibility. So the FDA now has accredited labs. They actually have, they approve a accreditation body, and that accreditation body then will approve a lab for specific tests. So currently they have the 9 most common biocompatibility tests. So you can see here, these are the ISO suite of tests that now labs can get accredited to those. And so a company can come to them and say, we'd like you to do the biocompatibility testing. And then they just have to write a short report, the accreditation lab, and then send it to the FDA. And the FDA has already accredited them, so they know that it's going to meet certain requirements. And so my former colleague, Terry Woods, did this and she published it. But if a review staff might need a minimum of 10.5 hours to look at biocompatibility testing, that wasn't from an accredited lab. But from an accredited lab with this summary test report, it only took them, say, up to an hour and a half. So again, these are things that help with getting through the FDA. I'm going to stop at the European Union. I think one of the changes in the landscape, Bob, you had mentioned about changes in landscape, is the CE mark was through what's called an MDD, medical device regulations. That was what was there up until this publication in 2017 that changed it to MDR, medical device regulations. And what this means was that they're getting closer to the FDA in terms of what they're asking for. So before, a lot of people used to go to Europe because the pathway was quote unquote easier to get your device approved. Well, with the MDR regulations, that's changed. The FDA, the notified bodies, which is the approval, they do the approvals for Europe. They're coming closer to the FDA. So there's stricter pre-market control of devices. One of the important things is that for companies that already had a device that was CE marked, they actually have to come back now and get it it's called a recertification process, and that's a huge pain point for companies. Because it's a lot of time and resources. The device is already on the market, and now they have to get approval again. And they have to do it if it's a high-risk device, they have to do it by 2027, December, and 2028 if it's a medium or low-risk device. So this has become a really big issue with the CE mark. And so this is something I'll say is it's ongoing and it's more challenging. And I think from what I've seen and talked with companies, like tissue engineered devices are class 3 now there. So there's definitely rules that are changing One thing I'm just going to highlight here with the Japanese market is Japan was notorious also for having a very long time for approval, like the FDA was. And so there was an initiative started between the Japanese FDA and the FDA to harmonize the device regulations, particularly for clinical trials. So now they have instances where there's a global clinical trial with just one protocol. So you don't have to do a clinical trial in the US, you don't have to do a separate clinical trial in Japan. You have one global protocol, and you have some patients in Japan and some patients in the US, and then it can get approved by both. So that's a huge thing, because now you don't have all that time and extra effort and money. And as long as the populations are, are representative, that's really what they want, is to have the representative populations. So I'll skip India and Israel. Lots of things going on in Israel. We work with a lot of Israeli companies. There's just a lot of med tech, and there's a big push within Israel to do med tech. So here's my summary slide. So how do we, successfully navigate regulatory approval? I'd say early interactions with regulators, do pre-submissions. That's what I always say. And providing a device evaluation plan, so you prevent, doing tests that are not needed or having to redo tests. If you have a novel device, you believe you have a novel device, apply to these programs, breakthrough device, the TAP program. That will really help expedite the approval, or at least get you into a clinical trial quicker. Leverage those device development tools, MDDTs, RSTs, guidance documents, standards. Look at computational modeling if that's something you can, basically leverage. And then look at experienced test labs to help accelerate the process. There's a lot of test labs out there, the ones that are experienced, that are potentially accredited. Those are going to help as well. And then, of course, plan for your entry into the global markets, right? Maybe you can streamline the testing. You can have a global clinical trial protocol, and understand the new regulations that are happening, particularly in Europe. And hopefully, you get one of those stamps right there, or maybe more than one of those stamps at the end of it. So thank you, and sorry I was a little bit over on time.
Thanks, Srin. That was great. Huge amount of information. We started on academic time, so yeah. So we'll open this up to some questions. I guess as people are thinking, the first one I'll ask is, a lot of companies are in that conundrum of they're trying to go the 510(k) pathway, but of course say, I'm completely novel. But yes, there's a predicate out there.
That's right.
It's exactly the same.
Yes.
Yeah. So how does that conversation happen? And are you going to get guidance then? Like if they say no 510(k), then is that when you think about a de novo pathway?
Yeah, exactly. I've seen it where a company will come in and you want to present your most desired outcome, right? Which is, maybe in this case to say I'm a 510(k), because obviously that pathway is very well defined. I think the most important thing I've seen that sometimes is lacking is identifying the appropriate predicate device in that case. There's companies that I've seen that really try to stretch it, and they say, oh, I want to take a device that maybe is intended for the foot, even though I have, something that I'm applying here. And so, doing that pre-submission, you want to go with what you say, we think this is a 510(k) for these reasons, and put together a strong argument. But then you can tell if the FDA is not really buying that, and they'll give you that kind of feedback. And then you can go in and say, okay, well, what do you guys think about a de novo? Because we clearly are, a moderate risk device. We're not like a life, supporting device or sustaining device, which would be really the class 3 types of devices. So that's kind of where I think a pre-submission really helps, because it goes back to, if you're not 100% sure what that pathway would be, it's best to go to the agency and put forward what you think it is, and then have that kind of negotiation of what it could be. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Other questions?
Hello, thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you had any recent examples of devices that received the breakthrough designation, and whether you could speak to what the criteria are that we should be thinking about if we're maybe trying to, strive for breakthrough designation.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so I'll give you one example. I think it's hopefully out there and published, but, or not published, but on the website. So in the cardiovascular space, there's an indication, so there's aortic transcatheter stents, or heart valves, I should say, stent frames, heart valves. And a lot of the ones that were previously indicated for was for stenosis. So there was a lot of calcification. And so there's been two companies that I can think of that have the other part of this, which is stenosis, is one part of it. Another one is where there's no stenosis, so calcification around it, but there is regurgitation. So it's aortic regurgitation, and that's a different. It's like it's a different kind of disease progression. So the company came in and said, we're different than the approved. The approved ones are really, if they use it is not, it's off label, and it's not actually treating the problem with those that have aortic regurgitation. And so they say our technology is better, essentially, than what's currently out there, because what's out there is really nothing except using off-label devices. So if you can identify it like that, so that's kind of an example of one where it's an indication that is maybe different than what the devices already out there are, that can fill a need. In that case, it was for something other than aortic stenosis. You could still do it for, say, aortic stenosis, but then you'd have to say why your therapy would be, substantially, better to get that breakthrough device designation. So there's a few different kind of ways to do it, but I think if you have a new indication, that's probably one where you can really look at it. The other one was on the orthopedic side. If you look at that bioretic, the degradable magnesium, that was given breakthrough device designation. And the reason is it's like a fully degradable metal, right? So that's a completely new concept here in the US, because there's no completely degradable metal for fracture fixation. So they were able to say, look, we have an advantage because we're not leaving a permanent implant in the body. This will degrade over time, and therefore you don't have possible issues with sepsis or having to remove the screw later on if there's something that happens. So that again shows that you have a better approach to what's existing.
But to follow up on that, that's just a theoretical advantage, right? They haven't proven necessarily.
Correct.
That not having a screw in there long term.
It's exactly
is
right.
Better than just leaving
Right.
a titanium screw.
Exactly. Okay. So you can, so a lot of this, a lot of this could be theoretical, and it's not quite proven, but it would get you into the breakthrough to be able to prove that.
Yeah.
Right, later on. So you don't necessarily need to have, it helps to have data, of course, if you do, but some of the arguments could be theoretical. Yes.
I think there's a question up here, Jonathan.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. You presented a couple of really interesting programs that the FDA is trying to implement, such as the TAP. And you also talked about going through accredited labs in order to, I guess, shorten the timeline to approval. And you also talked about how machine learning is becoming very kind of, or the FDA is interested in machine learning. Can you talk about whether the FDA is trying to use machine learning in their own approval processes and things like that to, I guess, streamline the approval process?
Yeah, good questions. So I can't speak for, I left in 2017. A lot has happened with machine learning and AI since I left. So I can't speak to what's happening now, but at the time there wasn't that there wasn't that outlook on using machine learning to do that, but it certainly could be now. One of the things that they were trying to do when I was there was they were trying to put together for software as a medical device, what would be the approaches, right? Because that had become a big topic for procedural planning, right? Pre-procedural planning is to be able to use software to identify landmarks and registration of imaging. So I think, though, for using machine learning within the agency, I don't know what they're doing now for that. They're planning to use it.
Hi, thank you for your talk. You mentioned, as you were going through your examples, that sometimes when the idea or the biomedical device is being put forth by the university, it's handled different in the FDA than it is when it's put forth by a company. Could you explain the
Yeah,
differences
it's-
potentially? Thank
Yeah,
you.
it's not necessarily handled differently. I think that in my experience is that it's with a company, there's obviously a regulatory, group within a company. Typically, there's it's very well set. With universities that come, sometimes that's not there, right? Like they have a great idea. They have the PI that's obviously developed that technology. And they don't understand the regulations as much. So the agency is more willing to help walk them through kind of that regulatory pathway. So they don't treat them any differently in terms of the bar of what needs to be achieved. It's more of kind of a collegial, like, these are the things that you need to do because you may not have been experienced in that, in terms of what types of, say, testing is needed or what the pathway is, as you mentioned, because I think there's a general understanding that, in an academic setting, there may not be somebody who's a full-time, regulatory consultant, that would be able to guide the company. So they're trying to help guide them during these informational meetings more than what you would normally see with a normal, like, if it comes from a company outside of an academic center.
Well, I'm seeing some students, I think, leaving for classes and
Yeah.
things like that. So I think we got to wrap things up. Srin, I'm looking forward to G.RAU's discount program for former advisors.
Yeah, we can work something out, I think, yeah.
That's great.
Especially if you say hide the pictures that you had showed previously, maybe burn them or.
I think they made you look pretty good. No, awesome. Thank you. That is just an incredible amount of useful information and
Thanks for having me.
coming to visit. So